We try our best. I mean, people
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Like we invite you to take your seats, please. Unless you have been invited to sit at the main table, it's 3 seating chairs for the front.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me much pleasure to be here tonight. As I was driving down, I was thinking what to talk about, given in particular the theme of your conference, and of course the very interesting topics you have got listed. As I was saying earlier on, when I came to the hotel, I said to Howard and Nesbitt that it's very difficult not to talk about the budget. In particular when it's so close by around the corner. I'll try and obviously stay away from it, but give you some general themes that really has been the hallmark of the previous budgets, but talk about some of the critical issues that I think we are facing as an economy, and indeed how particularly your organization and other sectors within the private sector can contribute to this very good trajectory that we are on. I'd like to start off on the basis that, you know, if you said to a few people or said to the country about 6 or 7 years ago that we would have a growth rate of 5.3% and a sustained economic growth rate of about 4% for 3 years, nobody would have believed us. But essentially that has happened. One of the fundamental reasons why it did happen was, I believe, because of the consistency in the policies that have been implemented, and the fact that the policies that were implemented weren't implemented for the short term, but indeed were implemented for the long term. And I think that is the hallmark of any successful economy. We, of course, have a long way to go to reach that particular level that we need to attain, but the consistency in policies is very, very critical. So whilst we made some very significant changes, for example, to the taxation regime, where company tax, within a span of short period was reduced all the way down to 20% from 33%, and personal income tax is reduced to 20% maximum, with the threshold starting at 15% previously, but now 7%, an income tax threshold increasing from $8,600 to $16,000, almost doubling. Was very, very significant. But it also meant that there would be some significant revenue losses on the face of it. And I can tell you many a story that when we as policy makers were trying to put this across, how the bureaucrats were very resistant to it, because on the face of it they were saying, oh, if we do this, we will immediately lose $54 million from our bottom line. But what they did not look at was the long-term impact of it. What they did not look at is that if people had more money in their pocket to spend, it would mean that there would be a more churning within the economy, more VAT would be paid. What they also did not look at is that for long-term sustainability, we need to take a long-term view. And that, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is probably the theme that I would like to talk to you or elucidate further with you in terms of what the private sector can do. One of the issues, I think, in Fiji, in particular after 1987, and to be frank about it, is that it's become a bit more of a each man, each woman, each business for themselves. And as I've highlighted in the past couple of weeks, there has also been a culture of not necessarily always adhering to the law. Whether it's creative accounting, or whether it's having a mate in the customs office, or whether it's under declaring, these have all become, in fact, the norm as opposed to the exception. And I think what we need to do as a country, as a society, as individual organizations, that we all need to have that particular focus to say, look, it is very critical for us to all be on the same page as far as behavior, as far as adherence to laws are concerned, because if we don't, we will then in the long term jeopardize our goals. In the same way we talk about climate change, that if we get companies to see the long-term sustainability of investing in climate change technology or investing in businesses that are climate and environmentally friendly, more to the point, it does lead to sustainability of your businesses. It does, in fact, also provide an opportunity for you now, as opposed to others who do not actually adhere to those principles, and puts you apart from the others. And that in itself is a business opportunity, a financial opportunity. So the message that I want to give, ladies and gentlemen, is that your organization actually can provide that growth. Your organization can actually give us that platform that we really need to secure. And I can tell you at the moment is not necessarily secure, because not everybody thinks that way. I'll give you a classic, I've heard some, as you know, we've recently given an amnesty to, sorry, this is dropping, an amnesty to those people who have assets offshore and they have not declared it. And I've actually heard a lot of people who have come to me through third, fourth party sources saying, look, we have it, but we won't declare it because we don't know what FIRCA will do. Even though FIRCA is now saying there won't be any penalties and they won't apply any retrospective assessments, we don't know whether they'll actually stick to it or not. So we're not going to do it. Notwithstanding the fact that we actually specifically changed the law in Parliament just in the last session, or session before last, where we said that there is absolutely no opportunity to have FIRCA have retrospective application. Now, indeed, that is now written in black and white, and of course, if FIRCA did do it, you have a legal opportunity to obviously take FIRCA to court, and you would win. So what I'm saying is that these people need to show a lot of confidence within the market. They need to show confidence in the laws, because if everybody does do that, we are actually in a good space. I think also there are a number of opportunities from government side that we need to do. And I know one of the critical issues that I get a lot of complaints on is work permits, for example, the slow processing of it, or the inability of the immigration department to understand that, not all pastry chefs are the same, for example. We got I was told of, for example, a particular company that's invested a lot in bakery through a supermarket chain, but they want to bring in, a top-class pastry chef into Fiji to have the supermarkets have all this pastry and bread and wonderful breads. But when they applied to the immigration department, immigration department said, no, there are many pastry chefs in Fiji, get them. Not actually understanding. So we are actually at the moment working through some process and perhaps some changes where we can have an input by people who actually understand the industry, or who may understand the private sector better, as opposed to a bureaucrat sitting down and making a decision about jobs and who we need and who we don't need. And it goes back to essentially that whole point about, the knowledge base that we're trying to create in Fiji. We are actually, ladies and gentlemen, way behind in many, many areas, and that's a fact. And we need to recognize the fact that we are behind in that. About 3-4 years ago, there was a lady, an Australian, who came to Fiji to work on an aid basis as a speech therapist. She was the only speech therapist in Fiji. And when she actually left her job, she wanted to set up a business in Fiji. And the requirement then was, if you're setting up a business, you have to have $250,000 up front. We waived that. So she could set up her business in Fiji, because we don't have any speech therapists. I don't know if there's any speech therapists in Fiji at the moment. I mean, maybe the dean and the vice chancellor can tell us, but I don't think there is at the moment in private practice. There is not enough, for example, private medical facilities available. So we are looking at innovative ways as to how we can get more private sector participation and indeed get the private sector to think about it. One thought is, the Minister for Health is here, and I'm sure he'll agree that in order to put less pressure, for example, on the public health system, we don't have enough private sector entrepreneurs in the area of medical services. So, for example, you shouldn't have to be a qualified radiologist or person who knows how to operate an MRI machine to set up a diagnostic center. Those of us who visited India, I mean, every time I go to India, I try and get an opportunity to visit one of these diagnostic centers. So for about $400, I go and get my blood pressure checked. I do my treadmill test. I get the dye put through my veins to see how the blood is flowing. I get an MRI done. That's medical tourism also. Not necessarily surgery, but it is actually medical tourism. So why can't we in Fiji do that? Why can't we, for example, allow entrepreneurs, and you also have to think outside the box, to be able to set up these centers as long as the people who are running the machines are qualified to run the machines. That really is the trick. So you are actually opening up. The reality is that Fiji is doesn't even have 1 million people. The reality is Fiji has had a huge brain drain since '87. We obviously are now trying to recoup some of that lost ground, through making, for example, having dual citizenship. For example, the economy is doing well, so a lot more former Fijians get attracted. Our younger Fijians want to stay back because we give them better working conditions, etc. Those sorts of things obviously are conducive, so it needs to work from both ways. But we have a huge ground to cover. And so we need more entrepreneurship. We need more executive sort of decisions being made in those spaces that we have traditionally not seen private sector go into. And I think that is very critical to do that. That also then helps the government to be able to focus on some of the core businesses and indeed perhaps leapfrog into providing those services rather than taking a linear pattern of development. And I think that's something that we need to get away from. We have this idea, well, this is Fiji, it'll take some time. But the reality is we cannot keep on saying that. Yes, it is Fiji, and yes, Fiji does want to be in a different space, but how quickly can we get there without obviously compromising standards? And I think this is very, very important for us to understand, whether it's adhering to labor standards, whether it's adhering to environmental standards, because it does, again, help you to be in a space that differentiates you from other people. I've said this now a couple of times. I said it to the CPA gathering last year, where I said to them that it is a pity that in Fiji we do not necessarily have the professional courage being shown predominantly by the professionals in Fiji to come out in the public space and give independent commentary on matters in society. Whether it's the budget, whether it's a particular policy by government, whether it's a particular decision facing businesses, or whether it's to do with the environment, we don't actually have that. We don't have people feeling, whether they're brave enough is the word, to be able to come out and speak and say, well, look, I think that this particular policy that government has put in, we think it's very good. Or we don't think it is workable because of X, Y, Z. And that we as the listeners, as the viewers, actually hear them and listen to them and say, well, yes, I agree with this person. And we don't judge them, that guy must be belonging to that party. Or because he's from that province. Or because, he's of that particular faith. That's why he's saying that. Or that ethnic group. Unfortunately, we tend to have that compartmentalization, which then restricts us intellectually to be a lot more robust in our thinking. The intellectual rigor is not there. And I think that's what Fiji needs. We need the intellectual rigor. In order to have that intellectual rigor, we need to break the shackles of compartmentalization. And that is very critical. And that is where you can actually get into this very new space that will actually help Fiji, really do very well. I don't just mean financially, economically, but as a country, to feel very, confident about itself. And in fact, setting the framework for the future. And that is very critical. I mean, the example that I did give at other times, talking about social issues, for example, when we passed approved the domestic violence decree at that time, we had a lot of people, for example, who made some comments on it or did not appreciate it, but the business community overall did not make any comment. The reality is, in this hotel, majority of the people who actually do your beds and serve you at the table are women. Now, if they are being bashed up the night before at home, and they don't have any recourse, purely from a financial commercial perspective, what do you think the levels of productivity will be the next day? What do you think the rate of absenteeism would be? Our garment industry, 7,500 people, out of which you could safely say 90% are women. What would happen to them? What would be the rate of productivity? So you see, this is many people relegate that to the social space or the private space, but it is not. So as a business community, as the executives, you also need to be able to have a particular level of concern about these areas, because it does actually affect you too. I mean, apart from the whole moral argument of it, it does also affect you too. So I think, if there's one message I can give is that you have a wonderful opportunity. Many of you are, senior executives in your own companies. You have a particular level of influence in your own organizations, of course, in your own communities you live in, and people obviously look up to you. If you're a manager in some company, people actually look up to you, and they do listen to you. You have that very critical opportunity to play. I mean, in the same way at the moment, we have this ILO thing hovering over our head, but the amendments that have been made by government to the the repealing of the Essential Industries Decree and the amendments to the Employment Relations Promulgation does actually help us comply, or in fact we now comply with the core ILO conventions, against which we were seen to have breached those conventions, but we're now in compliance with that. We have the Employment Relations Advisory Board being reconvened next week with an expanded Employment Relations Advisory Board, where we'll have 10 reps from each of the 3 representative groups. It again is very critical to understand the dynamics around. I mean, Nesbitt was there when we were earlier in Geneva this year. The whole dynamics of it is this, that we now have the complaint on the face of it, obviously is no longer a problem, because we've now complained with the core ILO conventions. We have certain worker organizations that actually are holding that over our head. Whether you call it a gun over our head or a hammer over our head, whatever it may be. But the point is, we've complied with the core ILO conventions. ILO wants everybody to be very happy and say that we're all in agreement with this. But the actual complaint was about the breach of the ILO conventions. We now complied with it. We're going to have ERAB now. We had, in fact, when we came back from Geneva, we actually said to the Fiji Trade Union Congress, I'm talking about this because I see that Felix is talking on Saturday in your program, but I think you need to get some contextualization around that, is that when we came back and we said, look, let's get an expanded Employment Relations Advisory Board in place. Let's not just have FTUC and Fiji Employers Federation. Let's get a bigger cross-section of representation. Let's get some other unions and other umbrella organizations. We were actually told that if you do it, we're going to go back to Geneva and say you've breached the agreement. So we were actually forced to go into ERAB with that limited number, with only FTUC, with Fiji Employers Federation and government, and then we came up with the amendments to the ERB, to the Employment Relations Promulgation. We've now got that, government's approved that, it's already in place, the check-off system is in place, collective bargaining is in place, the right to join a trade union is in place, it's all there. But now going into Geneva, that's now dealt with. But what Geneva now wants, from what we are told from our embassy, is that they want everybody to sign it's all okay. The reality is, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are countries throughout many countries throughout the world that have far worse off situations regarding employer-employee relationships, far worse off situations regarding the manner in which, for example, trade unionists and trade unions are treated. But they're not before the ILO. There are many other countries, for example, where they have standoffs, but it's not before the ILO. And the only reason being is because the 3 parties have decided to sort it out internally. And that's what we are saying, is that we need to have the ability to speak in our own space. If there is a breach of the conventions, we've now got rid of the conventions, let's speak within our own space. And that's what we're trying to do. For the first time on Saturday last week, when we had the budget consultations, we invited for the first time all faith-based organizations. Well, I shouldn't say all. There's something like 320 registered religious organizations in Fiji, but at least we called the 6 or 7 major ones. And we called 6 or 7 major trade union organizations, including umbrella organizations. But only 2 of them turned up. So the reality is that we can do only certain things. And we hope, with your assistance also, I know some of you will be sitting on, excuse me, some of you will be sitting on ERAB, that we will be able to work this through. Because at the end of the day, we have this thing called the Commission of Inquiry hanging over our head, which we don't want. If we do, of course, we have to roll with the punches, as they say. But the reality is it's better to avoid it. So I hope, and we look forward to your assistance and understanding. But one thing we do have to say is that all of us, I mean, it's not a question of trade union bashing, but of course many of them need to understand how modern day businesses work. Many of them need to understand that many trade unions in many countries have moved along and not taken the sort of 1950s, 60s confrontational type of unionism, but as opposed to developing a collaborative partnership and work with the businesses. And I think that is very keen. But on the other hand also, ladies and gentlemen, it is very critical that businesses have the same approach too. It is very critical. You know, the one marked sort of characteristic of trade unionism in Fiji is that trade unions are present very much in government or state-owned enterprises. The only reason why they're in the banking sector is because government used to own a bank before, NBF, which unfortunately is no longer around. But the point is that wherever we know that there are obviously exploitation taking place in certain areas, but there is a marked absence of trade unionism in those areas because they are very difficult areas. If you go to the retail sector, if you go to some of the other sectors in the construction industry, there's a marked absence of them. But that's where they need the most assistance. That's where exploitation does take place, which we are trying to stop. But these are the critical areas. So I think, you know, you have to also tell your fellow executives, companies that you deal with, that it is in the best interest for everybody that if you do look after your workers, in fact, you are reducing the opportunity for people to be able to exploit their position. And as you know, in Fiji, I mean, there's a very close linkage between trade unionism and political parties. So I think, you know, we need to, our Prime Minister, the Honourable Prime Minister, keeps on talking about depoliticization. From one perspective, essentially, it is very critical for us to do that because we need to be very objective in the manner we deal with certain aspects of our economy. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the other point that I'd like to very quickly touch upon is that essentially just tell you some of the key areas that we have been working on. As you know, there's been quite a lot of work being done in respect of some of the revising and modernizing of our laws, whether it's the ERP, whether it's the New Companies Act now, and of course the new tax bill, which is before the committee at the moment. It is critical for us to have the tax bill implemented as an act of Parliament from 1 January of next year. Because if we miss this boat, then it'll get applicable in 2017. And that's another, I think, 10 years down the track. We've already been through about 12 or 13 drafts of this income tax bill and widespread consultations. You will also see quite a few other changes in respect of some of the laws. We have been, as you know, threatening to bring in the Freedom of Information Act. We are currently working with the UNDP in respect of that, and we hope to table that particular bill in Parliament early next year. And of course, it does, FOI does bring about essential accountability and transparency within government processes, and we are very keen to do that. We, of course, will be not doing it all up. We'll be agency by agency because there's a lot of training that needs to be given in that area. But what I wanted to tell you is that by us doing that, it will also mean there'll be a lot of pressure in your businesses too. Because if people get accustomed to a culture of transparency, whether you're a bank or an insurance company or any other business, you will find that the culture will mean that people will expect that type of disclosure and that type of transparency in decision making, perhaps not legally, but also morally, making you obliged to be a lot more transparent yourselves. So those of you who do have a higher level of customer, transaction or frontal with customers, you'll see that that actually spills over onto your businesses too. And that's something to be, I think, on the lookout for. We also, I know there's been a lot of talk about, how some of the laws have been fast-tracked. I think some of the laws need to be fast-tracked. Otherwise, we do miss out the opportunity. But what we are trying to do is that to ensure that the laws or the bills when being presented to Parliament actually has a wide range of public consultations before it gets to Parliament itself. The budget, of course, as we've said continuously, will need to ensure that we have consistency in our policies. We want to look at some creative ways in terms of easing the burden of those people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. Government, as you know, owns a number of critical state-owned enterprises, and it gives us the opportunity actually to be able to, for example, give free water. It gives us the opportunity to give, subsidized electricity. But it is very critical also for government at the same time to ensure that our subsidies are actually targeted. So we will fine-tune our policies to ensure that subsidies actually reach the targeted audience. So it's not like free water for everybody up to 90,000 liters of water. It's for those households up to 30,000. In the same way that I've mentioned that we need to be able to look at our VAT system. It's a huge area of also leakage because we have certain anomalies within the VAT system itself. One very interesting fact before I round off. In the recent times, as you know, with the economic growth rate, you expect your VAT collection to increase. And mind you, VAT collection has actually increased with local sales. But very strangely, and I can tell you some of the reasons why, VAT collection at the border has decreased. It does not make sense. Because a country like Fiji, most of the consumables we have actually are imported items. So if your consumables locally has increased, there must be a commensurate, or at least close by, collection in VAT at the import level at the border. So there is understating of the value of goods coming into Fiji. There is also still a lot of creative accounting, a lot of close relationships between customs officials in particular and some of the businesses. And that is one area of focus that we want to give very stringently and also bring about certain laws that will help tighten that up. I think the point is that given that government has made a commitment, in particular to the private sector, to help it, to give it the assistance, for example, whether it's manufacturers, whether it's the financial sector, there is also a responsibility on all of you to actually ensure that you partner with us. It is very, very critical for us to have that relationship. So I openly send you an invitation. If you have any issues, you need to talk about it. Our doors, we're probably one of the most open governments, so you can, most people I think in this room, or half of you have my mobile phone number, to be able to talk, to be able to text messages and say, look, these are some of the problems, these are some of the issues we have. Because we need to take that collaborative approach, because we are on the building blocks of space. And if we are able to get past that, then it's actually very, very important for us to be able to do that well. I'm glad that you have somebody speaking about, having a knowledge-based society and building knowledge management and innovation. We really need to get into that space. We don't even, have dedicated even departments say regarding science and technology. And I think that's one of the areas that we need to look at into the future. And maintain people in Fiji to have that kind of knowledge base. So ladies and gentlemen, I think we're in a very, very good space as a country. We all have our own particular roles to play, some perhaps more than others, and we really look forward to your contribution so far. We look forward to working together with you. I think you also have a wonderful opportunity as executive management to also nurture the people who are below you. It is very critical for us to do that. We need to be able to invest in our younger generation. 200,000 voters, approximately, out of the 592,000 voters who were registered were below the age of 32 or 34. That gives you an indication of what percentage of the younger population we're dealing with. And more of them will occupy that space. So we have to invest in our people. This is why we've got TELS, why we've got the scholarship schemes, and now we've got the technical colleges to be able to have that level of investment, because all countries that have done well in the world have always invested in education and knowledge base. And that's where we'd like to be. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish you all a good evening and a very successful conference. Vinaka.